concern that girls and women are not valued, that the status of women and girls is very poor in the state. So it's really to enhance the value of girls. But also there are other ostensible impacts, such as delaying age of marriage, because at that time the age of marriage was significantly below the legal age, which is 18 years. And also the idea that sex ratio at birth would improve in the long run. Now for us, what's really exciting about this is that because the payments are protracted, that is at 18 if the girl is unmarried, and this is going to happen for the first time in 2012, because the girls who were born in 1994 are first going to be turning 18 in 2012 from the 1st of October onwards, because the 1st of October was the cutoff date when the program was initiated. It gives us a very unique opportunity to evaluate the program. There were eligibility criteria, as there are for any such like programs. I won't talk about this in detail later, but just so that you know what the program entailed. It was meant for socially vulnerable groups, so scheduled caste and backward class families, and in addition for below poverty line families that were not SCBC. Now, anybody who was eligible could not be a gazetted officer, because it's a certain class of employee in the government, which means you're above a certain level of income. And it was up to the third birth order girl that was born between 1st October 1994 to 31st December 1998. The program only in this schematic of this 25,000 rupees and these conditions, it only ran for these 4 years. So as I said, the first set of girls who will ever encash from this program will only be after the 1st of October 2012. And they obviously had to be domiciles of Haryana. So where does this program come within this larger scheme of what's happening? Because it happened in 1994 and a lot has happened after, and of course there was a context prior. So this is just a very brief schematic to tell you that the program happened in 1994 and 1998. Prior to that was a context of declining, very adverse and declining sex ratio, which has been talked about and documented very, very extensively in research. And then after 1998, between 1999 and 2004, the program continued in a very small way, because even in the first generation of this program, there was a small incentive of rupees 500 that was given to the mother if this girl child was born. So that small incentive continued in the next iteration, but the larger incentive discontinued. And it wasn't because there was an evaluation and they found anything. It was just for administrative reasons and for running out of certain kind of bonds that were used and financial reasons that the program's incentive changed. In 2005, in Haryana, as in other states, there has been a new program that has been initiated largely, which has newer conditions and more interceding conditions, and not just that if you turn 18, you can cash out and there's nothing else that's happening. There are no conditions between age 0 and 18. So this program, Abad, was a precursor to what is popularly known now as Ladli. And in this time, there are also other welfarist schemes and programs that are happening. So this is all happening, and we are evaluating one program, but just to acknowledge that the environment and the ecology of social development also has a lot other things, the action that is happening. Our question really is, what is the change in the value of girls through this time? Because that's one of the intentionality of the program. So, of course, as I stated, there isn't an articulated theory of change in the Abad program. And it is very similar to what Vimla also talked about. The government has these goals or milestones often, and then you have what you do, your activities or your inputs. But when we look at what could have been the articulated theory of change of the Abad program, what we see is we see these inputs, the scheme inputs, which are the incentives that I talked about. And clearly there was some action or activity for enrollment. Then there are assumptions, because there are no articulated outcomes or outputs, but there's an assumption that the monetary support at 18 will reduce the burden of girls, and the monetary support will also this at 18. So you're really not getting any money while the girl is growing up. But the assumption is that future promise of this money is going to alleviate the fact that you might be considering the girl to be a burden and may enhance her value. And the impact that we should see now at 18 or after the girl turns 18 is that we certainly should see delayed age of marriage, at least for the cohort of enrolled girls. Well, if the program was successful, we should see the value of girls to improve. And then in the long run, maybe even beyond this moment, we might see changes in sex ratio of birth if the program has had not only the direct effect on the beneficiaries, but also a larger diffusion effect of how the government, the messaging from this program. So just to kind of force us to kind of put this into a log frame kind of technology, we have inputs, which is at enrollment you have this 500 given to the mother and the bond that's created in the name of the girls, and then this 25,000 that she'll in cash at 18. The output should be the percentage of girls who were enrolled in 1994 who will cash out. So if you enroll 2,000 girls and all 2,000 cash out, that means all 2,000 remain unmarried in 18 and cash out, then you have 100% success in terms of your output. And the impact, which is not necessarily measurable as such or visible as such by the program, is a population level increase in the age of marriage and the higher value of girls. For us, for ICRW, what we are trying to do is we are trying to impose another frame, our own frame of reference of what would be our theory of change, considered theory of change, if we really want to see this value enhancement. So we have the same thing. We have the schemes with its targets and enrollment. We also have the assumptions which are not articulated here, but the assumption is that the program assumes that this monetary benefit will enhance the value and reduce the burden of the girl. But what we think we should also see is this domain of values, which then could be maybe demystified and measured in terms of attitudinal shifts, changes in allocations and redistributions within the household, between siblings, between gender siblings, aspirational changes in aspiration of girls, and then the delayed marriage for the enrolled cohort, which is both an outcome and output, which I had already talked about in the previous slide. And then the impact, which is delayed age of marriage, value of girls improved, and SRB in the long run. Now, these are not necessarily things that we could measure just for the enrolled cohort, but for a larger population, which we intend to do with our survey. So the key questions for us are several for this evaluation. One is, how do people connect with the intent of the scheme, and how do people understand and connect with the intent of the scheme? So if the intent was to enhance the value, is this how popularly people understand the scheme? What is the expected change due to the scheme? What is the measurable expected change, and how will that happen? Because we haven't yet done the evaluation. Then specifically, will these incentives work to improve value, bring about a change in value? And that's the one question that I'll talk you through a little as we go further. Who will actually get the cash, and how will they use it? This is something we will be measuring. And largely from all of this, our large question is, does such a single lever, we're using one policy instrument for social change, really create that intended impact that we desire? So I'm going to now talk on the value piece. Very briefly, before I get to that, I just wanted to talk about the research methodology. It's a very rigorous, very extensive research that scopes over 4 years. We've just finished the formative research where we were asking the questions like who are the beneficiaries and who are the eligible non-beneficiaries. So who participated, but then who didn't, and why was that the case? Then that's very important for us to, for our methodological approach of understanding selection bias. And how do values really get defined in this context? And how do we create a match sample? Because our methodology is going to match eligible beneficiaries and eligible non-beneficiaries. And then we're going to get into our impact evaluation subsequently, which is next month onwards, to really try and understand whether the program was successful and did it enhance the value of girls. There's also going to be a lot more qualitative research and process evaluation to look at the how, and then active engagement to get the word out. and also to share our learnings in different forums such as this one. And very briefly, because some of you might be curious about the methodology, there was no baseline in 1998, so this is a quasi-experimental study where we are really going to we are going to match a cohort of enrolled beneficiaries using propensity score matching to eligible non-beneficiaries, and there are going to be two age cohorts. One is in the ages 16 to 18, and then a younger cohort 14 to 16 who is not so proximate to the cash out, so we're getting less adulterated effects, because the ones who are now 16 to 18 are very close to cashing out, so what we might get from them is different. And we will do a survey of these girls. The sample size is 1,500 in each of these age cohorts for both groups. So we'll survey them in September of this year, just before the cash out process begins. And the older age cohort, we'll follow them again subsequently in 2014 after they've cashed out, to really look at how many of them remained unmarried and what did they do and what were their aspirations met, etc. So one of the things that is very important for us to understand this value piece, do people really understand that this program is meant to enhance the value of the girls, is to understand also what is the popular perception of the government's intentions. And very briefly, what you find here is when through our formative research, when you talk to beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries and key stakeholders, as that people's relationship, how they relate to the scheme, is in terms of this understanding that the government has set up the scheme to really alleviate the burden of having a girl and to help them with dowry and marriage expenses. So kind of very much reinforcing patriarchal values and even norms that maybe the scheme is actually trying to challenge. And the question whether the scheme will enhance value or will it make only a limited difference in appreciating the value of girls. I'll get into that now using my formative findings. I have 5 more minutes, so I'll have to rush through this. I think even if I don't discuss the findings, I think it was very important that we've done a lot of analysis and thinking on the theory and the concepts of what is value and how do they get defined. And that has been very important for us to really understand our data. What we have then, therefore, put together for ourselves in our conceptual frame is, one is that cultural and normative constructs that we observe, such as marriage, dowry, patriarchy, mobility, these constructs really provide the backdrop to understanding values. And in our frameworks, we are looking at values at 2 levels. One is imbued or intrinsic, and one is invested. So imbued values are values that a girl instills or internalizes in herself by virtue of the fact that she's a girl. And then the invested values are the actual investments that might be made in a girl because she's a girl. And that these values, imbued and invested, and values across these domains actually interact with each other, and they're dynamic, and they're shaped and articulated in relationship to the changing socioeconomic context, both in the individual and societal level, and they're not self-evident, they're not visible, and therefore have to be inferred from practices and norms. And why is all this important? It's important because basically it's telling me my theory of change is not linear. I cannot box it. It's essentially non-linear, it's complex, it's dynamic, and it's going to be difficult to predict it, along with it being heterogeneous. So I would like to challenge or understand a little bit more when Lindsay says that, yeah, all of these criticisms are there, but they might not be valid. And we want to know, really, okay, then how do we really take all of this non-linearity and put it into boxes, which of course we won't necessarily do. But for us, again, this part, the formative research, helps us really develop our survey instrument and really try and capture value that we really want to. From our research and findings, what we find is that there are key value domains, and these are important because this is going to help us develop our survey tool. One is, what is repeatedly and very predominant, is that marriage is the most important rite of passage for girls, and that a girl from the time that she's born is considered her marital family's wealth or pariah dhan. And in the interceding years from the time a girl is born to the time that she gets married, what is a very predominant aspect of her relationship to society and her family is the fact that she has to, her conduct as a good girl is very important, and her chastity has to be maintained and protected. And so because of that because of concerns around chastity, a girl is the bearer of a family's honor, and honor is placed on her to maintain, guard her chastity, which according to society is the primary wealth that a girl has for her family. And then from the parents' perspective, it's a responsibility to marry a daughter, and that responsibility and obligation can often compromise a parent's or a family's position, both economically and socially. So the whole burden of having a certain kind of a marriage into a certain kind of home, and the dowry, concerns about the dowry, preoccupies a family from the time a girl is born. And because she's a burden, therefore, a girl has to conduct herself in certain ways throughout her life cycle, both in her natal and marital home, to redeem that. And this is what our data and our formative research is telling us. This is just a very distilled version of our data. I don't have time, so I'm going to really skip over some of the other. I was going to exemplify what we really found, but what's very important is that what are these core constructs that inform a girl's value? It starts from the time that she's born in her natal home, through her mobility, her education, food allocations, which are differential across boys and girls, her labor and employability, and then through her marriage. So, okay. I'm going to skip over these. These are just some examples of my data of these various value domains, to get to the fact that basically what we are finding is that while it's true that there is a very dismal situation and construction of what are the values for girls, there are shifts, there are small shifts that we are observing, and that we imagine that we will observe in our surveys, which are in the age of marriage, and that's predominantly going to happen because of the monetary incentive that we expect that it will possibly shift the age by 1 to 2 years. There is a heightened awareness of early childbearing and its consequences on health, and therefore there might be a shift in the age of marriage and the fear of law. There are shifts in educational investments for girls. There are higher aspirations for jobs and higher education. Girls are more assertive than the previous generation of young women. They are aware of their entitlements. There are certain choices that are being presented to them that weren't previously to women. And there is mobility, but it has costs. It has greater vigilance. So it is there, but it's still restrained. And so there are shifts, but like I said, the whole domains of value are very dynamic. There are some movements which are in the positive side, and then there are things that are also in the negative side. So in totality, you don't know where you might end up. If you could have an equation and model values, you don't know how much it will be an incremental shift in value if that could be measured. And of course, it can't, but if we could. So what does this really mean, really looping back to what we started with in terms of what our expected theory of change was, and this whole construct of values? What we really are saying here is that values are intangible, and what you'll really observe and measure through your survey are practices and norms and attitudes. And these values are changing, as I just said, but they seem to be bounded. In the context of Haryana, very interestingly, all of these values seem to be bounded by the construct of marriage. So yes, we will do this because it improves marriage prospects. We will educate our daughters because she'll be more marriageable, because she'll bring greater prosperity to her marital home. So all these discussions of values get bounded by marriage. And we think that the scheme, the idea that the government is supporting this household, seems to be addressing the notion that girls are a burden. So it's not necessarily because, yes, the government thinks girls should be valued, but in fact addressing the notion that girls are a burden. And basically, the idea of the scheme is not interfacing with values that are actually getting imbued and invested in girls as she's growing up through her life cycle. So it's a very complex point, but what I'm trying to say is that because the scheme is not interacting with the girl or the household in any other complementary efforts as she's growing up, so we are only addressing what is happening or considered at birth and not really what might be changing in a girl's life as she's growing up. And that the point that I just made, that makes the theory of change basically not only nonlinear but also unpredictable and heterogeneous. And in the end, what I'd say is that we might still observe the impact or the desired output of delaying age of marriage till 18 and cashing out, but we may not see an impact on the valuation of girls. So if we go and we say the program is 100% successful because all the enrolled beneficiaries cashed out, what I'm saying is that we may observe that, but we may not really see a shift in the value of girls. You may see an increase in violence, more restrictions in mobility, which actually you already are. And so, where do we go from here? We have not completed our evaluation. We're still going into the design of our survey. But I think also just, if I had to step back because right now the government of many states are designing conditional cash transfer programs. It's a very current topical response of the government right now to these situations. And so I would say that programs that are so designed that there really may be missing opportunities of enabling change in norms if really we are not really interacting with the space of where values are getting created, imbued, and invested. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya, for giving us a glimpse of the complex interlinkages, nuances, and dynamic pathways of change. I'd like to open the floor to questions. We'll take 3 questions at a time.
Hi. Just a couple of things here. First of all, this whole scheme and a lot of similar schemes go with a huge assumption that, number one, reduced age at marriage, fetal feticide, etc., only happens with scheduled caste, minorities, communities, and with those who are below poverty line.
Good.
And that these communities can be easily lured by a simple promise of 25,000 rupees coming after 18 years of time.
Correct.
So I don't know if your evaluation will look at this assumption and to what extent this assumption holds true. My second question is that you've talked about values and you've touched a bit on age at marriage, which I think will be the most tangible thing to see because they will wait till 18 to encash that. But you haven't touched on the sex ratio aspect of it. Is this something that your evaluation will also touch upon, because that is one of the 3 impacts that this program looks at?
Any more questions?
My name is Thomas de Hoop. I'm of 3IE. Actually, I have 2 comments on your evaluation. And one of them is more like a suggestion. So you're talking about matching eligible with non-eligible households. I would say that there are many other opportunities for quasi-experimental designs, taken into account that you have a very clear age cutoff. So I don't remember the dates exactly, but apparently girls that are born on 29th of September of a certain year are not eligible for the scheme, and girls that are born on the 1st of October are eligible for the scheme, so this raises a lot of options. Yeah. Second, also with regard, in comparison with the presentation of Lindsay, so I fully agree with the fact that your theory of change is very complex, and I've been working on similar, very complex theories of change wherein social norms interact with theories of change. But these are assumptions that can also be tested to some extent, and both through qualitative methods and through quantitative methods. And I was wondering just how you were planning to do so.
Hi, I'm Ravi from Vritti. Interesting, very enlightening process of research that you have laid out. my question relates to the theory of change that you are building now, or kind of going to discover it at the end of the evaluation. Essentially, because we know the framework of equality, between girls and boys is a major theory of change. If it can happen, then we can see the change has happened. So are you looking into your research through, because I could not see, you're basically examining girls and status of girls, how it's changing, vis-a-vis how girls are treated within a family, vis-a-vis how, values regarding girls' values within a family and communities are, but what happens with girls and boys, between girls and boys within a family?
Great. Thank you so much. These are all the things I wanted to say but couldn't because I fell short of time, so this is perfect. This is why you have questions. I think the first issue was around the eligibility. It's very well known with the whole issue of declining sex ratio that some of the most adverse behavior is not happening in the poorest and the social vulnerable groups. So yes, there is a first and foremost design critique as to why certain groups were targeted and others not, if really the context was one of adverse sex ratio. Now, we are not at the point where we are redesigning the program, but we are looking at that, and we will look at these relationships and be able to observe that, it's very difficult to have answers for everything through one evaluation, but definitely the whole notion of who was eligible and why, and were they really vulnerable, and what kind of adversities might be happening in those contexts is definitely something that we're going to look at. And also the issue that you talked about not even the fact that the BPL families are where the sex ratio must be most adverse, but the fact that if you are really poor and the payment is so protracted, what is the value of that money to you in current time when you're only going to get it in time period plus 18 years? So there are considerations around that, and we will be also serving an equal number of 3,000 mothers of these families. So, the thing is that there were things about my methodology that we couldn't talk about in the shortage of time, but it's a pretty extensive surveys and pretty rigorous methodology where we want to understand some of these things. And also there are other issues around BPL because, at that time in 1994, was everybody a BPL card holder? And was it so clear? And it wasn't, as what we are learning. I think there are real challenges for us because in time today we are going to go back through different kinds of recall and life history analysis to understand who was poor in 1994. This is not straightforward. There are lots of challenges. So however much we might say that we have it all figured out, there's a lot of complexities for us because we have a huge recall period for our survey. The issue of the age of marriage, the sex ratio at birth, I think what we will definitely do is that we will have a lot of data for all our households. We'll have a data of siblings and the gender of all the siblings that are born. So we can do a lot of analysis which is more secondary in nature because we'll have a huge pool of households where we'll get to know what was the actual sex composition of those households for beneficiaries and non-beneficiary families, and we can pool all the families because in this particular context maybe it won't matter whether it's a beneficiary or non-beneficiary family. And so we will be looking at some kind of analysis of sex ratios at birth as well from our data. And of course, the big thing is that the census has just come out. So whether we do it or not, I don't think the census results are particularly heartening for us right now because it's a very, very slow climb of the sex ratio at CSR, as we can see. Yes, you're right that there are other methodologies. Before we got into this research, we had thought we would do the propensity score matching. We are going to continue to do that, but because we will have the advantage of looking at girls born in the neighborhood of that time period. So we've also considered looking into that. And we are still kind of finalizing our study methodology, and we are in the process of thinking through that, and I'd love to talk to you more about that. And there is going to be a lot of qualitative and quantitative data. It's a mixed method approach, so there's going to be a lot of analysis of qualitative data to really understand what was happening, what's changing. And to answer your question, discrimination within the household is a very core construct. I couldn't talk about all of that right now, but we're going to look at both. For us, we're looking at shifts between siblings, within a family, the girl who's a beneficiary versus other girls, between the girl and a boy sibling, and shifts over time. So we have like several frames that we're going to look at in terms of trying to quantify and qualify how values are different or have shifted over time or between birth orders or between boys and girls. I think I've answered all the questions.
We have time for one more question at the back.
Hi.
You'll just be given a mic, 1 second.
Hi. I'm Elizabeth Callender with USAID. Is your report going to include recommendations for future interventions?
Yes. I think we wouldn't have got resources from USAID if we weren't interested in doing that. But no, that's for us. We are a research organization that's doing research to push the frontiers of policy and programs. So it's absolutely critical for us. It's not limited to just a research study.
And just very quickly,
yes.
Since this was only for 4 years and then it was discontinued,
yes.
Are you also looking at what happened once it was discontinued?
We aren't. We've been asked, why don't you also evaluate the Ladli program? What we are saying is we'd love to if we got resources. We would be happy to look at other things. But what is very important is that we are going to do some kind of through more ecological analysis to see what else was happening at that time. And also through secondary research and other methodologies to really understand what else was happening. But we're not going to evaluate anything else systematically.
Well, first, I hope we can thank our speakers. I think that was excellent. So, Lindsay, Vimla, Priya, thank you very much. And also, we are hoping to collect information about your thoughts on how this process went. So I'd really appreciate over the next 20 minutes or so while we wrap up, if you could fill in the registration and feedback forms, that would be great. So I think what we'll do is I'll share some initial reactions to each of the presentations related to theory of change, and then I'll pass over to Catherine and hope that Catherine can share, her reactions as well. And ideally, if there's some time, 5 to 10 minutes at the end, we can have some, if there's some broader discussion that we might be able to have, that would be nice. If not, we'd like to welcome everyone to, in addition to that, welcome everyone to coffee afterwards so we can keep the conversation going. So I'll be brief. I think, so in Lindsay's presentation, looking at school-based malaria intervention, that was a great introduction to help us understand theory of change. For me, the way I was trained in theory of change was to use it as a way to, a lot of international development programs require these logical frameworks, and there's a big push now in the government of India to do results frameworks. So I've always looked at theory of change as a way to be a little bit more flexible and creative, try to figure out what you should be measuring, and then how to transpose that on kind of a more structured, rectangular grid-type framework. And so I thought that a lot of those points, as in terms of a basic how you go about thinking about designing the theory of change, was very useful. Particularly with the most important part, which is identifying outcomes first. Starting from outcomes and then working your way back into inputs. And I think a second part, which in my experience differentiates good theories of change that are useful for thinking critically about the program and adding some value in how you might design and how implementation is going, is to what degree assumptions are really identified and explicated. I think that's potentially the most valuable part about doing a theory of change, is seeing how you do go from outputs to outcomes. And that's a part where we also tend to have our most our some of our projects we really like really rest on grand assumptions. And so I like the slide that said, then a miracle happens from going from one level to another level, because sometimes we do seem to be relying on those. And then another point I thought was interesting was the timing of a theory of change and when you go about doing it. I think in terms of program design, it's excellent to do it at that stage. And then you eventually have it, and it's kind of locked and it's linear, and then your program gets implemented and it actually collides with the real world. So I think that one thing that I think is useful is coming back, having with the stakeholders in a program, setting a time, maybe 6 months or a year out to come back and revisit the theory of change, and does this actually seem to hold up? Then, of course, you run into the problem of, you've got a program, and how much time do you spend reanalyzing the theory underpinning it, and how much time do you actually spend seeking to implement it? So on VMLAs, on the National Program to Universalize Education, SSA, I thought that, first is the idea that the need to kind of have a look at constructing a theory of change when one wasn't necessarily there. So that's the role of an evaluator, a theory-based evaluator, is one starting point to make sense of this program for yourself, even if it's not explicated for you, is to create your own theory of change and use that as a basis for an evaluation plan. So I thought that was very good. And then, having the role of the theory of change then, kind of set what indicators you're going to be looking at in terms of your evaluation. And I also, one point I think which is a criticism of theory of change is that, in this kind of one-page document, you often there's not room for showing disaggregated impacts, especially when you get to the outputs and to the outcomes and to the final impact, the impact that you're looking at. And I think that's, just your starting point was to look at, within scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, why do you see these higher drop rates? So just having that be a starting point and making sure you're looking at disaggregated impacts in your theory of change. And, I don't think that Vimla would really express it like this, but for me, when she began to look at her different hypotheses, they weren't necessarily competing hypotheses, but she laid out, 3 hypotheses about why students may not be learning. Is exclusion due to poor self-image, teacher attitudes, corporal punishments. And that's it. Essentially, I think that what she was doing was then looking at the theory of change coming from each of these assumptions, and then going, based on these different theories of change, choosing the appropriate data collection methods. And for her, she believed that there were ethnographic data collection methods, qualitative data collection methods. So I think that that's something that's interesting to keep in mind, and she put that right out front, is that it's often, if we're honest, maybe we have competing theories and we have more than one theory of change. And so I think to have all those mapped out and to collect data on those is also something that was a very valuable part of her research. And just as a side, I also think it's quite interesting that some of your conclusions from these qualitative approaches carefully or closely are similar to some of the conclusions that J-PAL has come up with in South Asia in terms of why learning levels might be low in government schools. In terms of elitism in schools, students falling behind, not catching up. Every year they fall further behind because the curriculum is taught to the top of the class. And then students also then failing to believe in themselves after they begin to fall behind. So I think there's a nice complementarity between your research and some of the research that we have done. And finally, on Priya's analysis of a conditional caste transfer, I think that's another, as an evaluator, that's another important lesson. I think if I would have taken a look at that program at first and would have been asked to do an evaluation, I might have just stopped. My impact might have just been, well, for the number of girls who were enrolled in the program, how many made it to the end, how many cashed out. And I think as an evaluator, not accepting this prescribed theory of change, that's identifying not as the impact of the program, but as an output, and being more ambitious about the impact that you believe that the program was really trying to drive at, which, changing a conception of the value of the girls, and also ideally delaying marriage beyond 18. I think that is another potential criticism for a theory of change is blind spots. And the blind spot of not mapping out unintended consequences. So I think here that evaluation really brings it to the forefront. The unintended consequence of actually monetizing, providing 25,000 rupees at 18 when a girl's married might, instead of trying to challenge gender norms, actually might have gone to reinforce them in this case. And I think another thing that's an important part of theory of change is this concept of dosage. I don't know if that's the right word, but if you're looking about how an output would translate into an outcome, or an outcome would translate into your impact, thinking that it's not just about what you're doing in that stage itself, but how big the dosage is. And so really whether that is realistic, that is going to drive a big enough change to get to the next level. So I think that's a good question, is if you're going to take a monetary approach to try to change gender norms, is 25,000 rupees 18 years later, is that a big enough dosage to, if you think that it could change attitudes, is that a big enough dosage to be effective? Just a couple of last concluding thoughts. I think best used theory of changes should be kind of viewed not as a product, but as a process, something that's revisited, as a way of thinking to ask fundamental questions about context, about actors, about change, about strategy. And then again, the need to think about types of things like dosage, unintended consequences, feedback loops, as Lindsay brought up, and also power relationships often get left out of theories of change. So that's my reaction to each of the three presentations, and I'd like to pass over to Catherine, who I'm sure will have much more illuminating things to say.
Well, you've certainly given some useful thoughts on all of them, so I'm not going to say too much, because I think we'd also like to hear about, in the sort of 10 minutes we have left, other people's experiences with different programs or trying to use theory of change. I always find Vimla refreshing because she's sort of not one to jump onto jargon. And I think theory of change, and logical frameworks, etc. These are sort of new tools for something that's been around for a long time. It's not as though before theory of change people were kind of randomly picking programs without any logic or without any assumptions about why they were doing what they were doing. So this is kind of an iteration of a tool, but it's essentially, a set of tools that have been around in lots of ways for many years, and we're just trying to get better in our business at sort of refining them and using them in different ways. I thought that the panel as a set worked beautifully, because I thought Lindsay started with a very, very simple example. Not that it's, I'm sure, simple in the field, but those are often the best learning examples, sort of to walk us through that. And in her case, it was an example where the evaluator's there from the very beginning. They can choose to randomize. They can work with the program to articulate the theory of change, so to sort of lay it out in that way. And then we move to sort of the reality that probably many of us are in, where the theory of change is not articulated in that kind of language, where we're often coming in later, where we're trying to sort of recreate. So I thought that sort of worked very well. I think the other thing that we saw as we began to break out in the CMS version of their theory of change, it was a great example, but I think you see also when you actually have these very complex behavioral, attitudinal kinds of programs, you see a couple of things. One, that theory changes. It's not as though that theory is static, and it's not as though the treatment is static. So in Vimla's case, if you've got the treatment's effectively the school system, it's not as though that's static, that every child is getting that there's some sort of program fidelity, and every child gets the exact same kind of teaching from their headmaster, etc., or the exact same kind of rollout of that program. So, in these complex cases, you have very different types of treatments. You've got a context that's changing. So even the way that the program is understood, is delivered, is articulated by implementers, by society, is also changing. So again, that sort of moves away from this kind of more simple understanding of what it is you're even talking about looking at. But I think when we see these sort of very complex maps of sort of the theory of change being mapped out, I think this raises this question of, oh my God, what do we evaluate? Sort of what piece of this can we realistically look at? And I think that also takes us to these different approaches. So in Vimla's example, she talked about one study that she's working on, but there were several other studies there. And similarly, different elements of those theories of change, other people are working on them. So there's some things, some transitions, some changes that are better understood, where there's a body of research, maybe where there's been synthetic evaluations on some of those questions. So I think part of the job of the evaluator is also understanding what's the body of evidence, and if we only can sort of really interrogate a few of these levers or a few of these change processes, which are the ones that we should invest in? What's sort of fairly well understood, what's not very well understood? And then I think there's a huge sort of methodological challenge of then trying to weave together different types of evidence. So once we have, Vimla studies and all those other studies, how do they dance together? And how do we connect them? And how do we look across them? Which is, to me, again, a very gaping space in terms of methodological work and evaluation, and sort of trying to do that. So that's a very rich space. I mean, again, I guess the thing that I just want to flag is it's just a tool. You're trying to get closer to understanding reality, but whose reality, which reality, what piece of that reality. And so again, it's not about confusing that if you get the complexity right, you'll somehow discover the truth. But you're sort of just getting closer and trying to understand and articulate. You're trying to at least articulate whose assumptions are here and sort of what change is happening. And what I really liked, I think, is this idea of using theory of change. I think we all understand that policies and programs can reinforce dominant ideas about how change happens, what kind of change should happen, or what kinds of ideas we hold valuable in society. And I think by trying to make explicit what are those theories, what are those values, and then questioning whose values are they, evaluation can be used to not only sort of maintain dominant value systems and approaches, but also to sort of challenge and critique them. And I think articulating them first is sort of the first step to that. But I'll stop there, and I think you're going to take some more comments or questions from the floor.
We have 5 more minutes if people have comments and questions to make to the panelists.
Speak. I think it was really an interesting panel and the entire event. So thank you for organizing it and to our panelists. I just wanted to make a quick point that I think this session gave the impression that theories of change are only useful in the context of evaluation, and I don't think that's necessarily true. I think on the program side as well, there's a lot of value that theories of change can add, and maybe if we need to frame it a little bit differently, and then we won't not have issues of there is no theory of change and we have an evaluation and those kind of things. And sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Kabir from Catalyst Management Services. So.
Yeah, I think the presentations were building towards how it's important to have a clearly thought out theory of change for these different programs, which captures the complex interlinkages and dynamic pathways of change.
Is there a mic at the back? Yeah.
Talk about the educational program, particularly the one being raised. I think that I completely understand the conversation she has talked about. I do want to share that there are assumptions, if not necessarily well articulated. So, for example, if you have, and this is a pan-India, education is a state subject, the implementation is happening at the state level, lot of decisions happen at the state level, and the resourcing largely is done at central. So I think there are assumptions such as, for example, if we did teacher training, they will teach better. There's a huge, I want to go back to what Lindsay talked about in your relatively simple, clean, nice presentation. But in a more complex one, there are huge amount of assumptions when you talk about teacher training itself. Right? And then what impact it may have in the classroom. Or when we say community participation, or parents will participate in the school. Now these are norms and guidelines set right up on top. So these are assumptions. that it will improve education, and what activities might be. So there will be school monitoring committee or school management committee. Those are the activities linked to assumptions, and then looking at, so for example, attendance. Higher level of attendance is expected, and it is being incentivized by things like midday meal, or if 70% of the attendance is there in the classroom, the child should be promoted, because there is an assumption if the child is sitting in the classroom for 70% of the time, at least understands at least 40% of the learning, which may not be true. That's all an assumption. But the thing is, there is that kind of theory behind it. I don't believe that we've been able to look at those assumptions more critically, and therefore the structure of the activities which has been panned out. And of course, from state to state it differs. The changing scenario. So, for example, for the last presentation, I do want to say, I think in last 20 years, or last 18 years, so to say, in your case, the social change, besides, sex ratio is still it's mind-boggling issue. But I think the overall, I think just the notionally, the India shining kind of story, kind of baffles you. And the other part is, and that's my question to you, is do the social norms as we understand, and you worked on it, that does it really for below poverty line and for the social classes? Is it as important, what you talked about marriage, for example, and the notion of marriage, that the chastity and all the issues around it, how important at what levels? I think those would vary in terms of those who are formulating policies, people like you and me, and those who are at the other end of it. So, and I do believe it's
Any more comments or questions?
My name is Anant Sudarshan, and I work at JPAL as well. I just had a small comment, based on Lindsay's presentation, where you talked about black box evaluations and black box program designs as not being a good idea. But the way I've always thought about it is that in the examples we've spoken about here, which are retrospective evaluations of large programs, there's clearly a great deal of benefit in trying to articulate what a theory of change might have been and what worked or what didn't work. But in practice, if you look at other fields outside of, say, economic development and public policy, if you look at, for example, how engineering design is done, or if you look at how a lot of science is done, the assumption in many of those projects is that because there is so much complexity and so many things we do not know and will not be able to test, what we need to privilege is a sort of rapid prototyping approach, which is inherently a black box approach, but which is saying, how can we quickly do a number of experiments and tests to figure out what works, simply because we do not have the ability or resources to test amongst many very complicated theories of what might work. And so I was just wondering if there is a point at which we would prefer to draw out that long complex theory and test different paths versus a type of program or a point in the process where it's more important to just try different things, and because we don't know enough about the ways they work.
Should I respond? Yeah. So I think that you're definitely right. There are a lot of things, particularly in engineering and sometimes in medicine as well, where you can't unpack the box. I mean, it's just too complex, and it's just easier and sometimes more cost-effective to just go ahead and try different. For example, in engineering, try different nozzles to figure out which one actually gets you the right spray, something like that. But I think with more social programs, they're much more long-term, and so I would say that it's not more cost-effective. I would argue that there's never a time that it's more cost-effective to just try a number of things, particularly in 18-year programs, and figure out what happens best. And I think that even if you aren't sure what all of the mechanisms will be, it's always valuable to articulate as much as you possibly can. So there still might be some unknown factors. There will always be unknown factors that you can't control for. But if you can articulate as much as possible, you're better off.
Can I add? Can I just say a couple of things? It's a very interesting thought. I was just thinking about it, like if there was a 5% or a 1% risk in a kind of more mechanical or a science experiment, then you're able to perhaps live with that risk because of the gain for the larger good. And sometimes in the kind of work that we are talking about, we are really concerned about the 5%. And for example, although in this case it's not 5, maybe it's 33 or 40%, but often the lens we use in social development is that we are really trying to look at the most adverse consequence for the most vulnerable rather than the larger good. So I just think that's also a different perspective that we have in social science, which adds much more burden to the kind of research we do.
Thank you.
I think that's really the worm's eye view. That's what we are trying to do.
Thank you everyone for participating. There's coffee outside and we hope we can continue this conversation over tea. Thank you.
As for evaluate your assessments, just please drop them off on the back table.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, nice to meet you as well.
It went as you expected.
It was better.
Was
I
it?
liked it a lot. No, I think so. To be honest, I think that the most important thing is getting everyone
And
one room and one
I think it should be possible if you'd like to post it on the IDIC website.
a lot of people here are interested in monitoring by it's one of these things, theory of change, but using theory of the change to talk about broader issues.
Yeah.
I think that in that context is very, very
Yeah, and you really certainly achieved that, I think, because of the kind of
Sorry, I won't be able to stay for coffee.
No, of course. Thank you for that. I look forward to
Yeah, please. It'll be very nice.
Bye.
It's good to see you.